Okay, today I want to talk about my journey to ancient Egypt. Um, I'll begin with what I call the tale of two bookstores. I went to college in Manhattan. The college was uptown, a very good school, but certain things couldn't be found there. And so there were bookstores in lower Manhattan that covered the subjects I was interested in. And so one, I think called Sam Weiser's, was one of the largest collections in the world of books on the occult, the esoteric, the occult, mysticism, whatever you want to call it. It had this vast collection, I think 3 floors of musty books and musty people sitting around pouring through everything. And I just found it fascinating, that whole world of the esoteric, the occult. What was that all about? How did it come about? All this kind of hidden wisdom that has followed us through the ages. Then there's another bookstore, I forget the name of it, but it had books from the Soviet Union and the Communist Party and a really good collection of books on Marxism. And I may have been the only person who went to both bookstores. I'd be very interested to see if there's anybody else who went from one bookstore to the occult store to the Marxist store. But in a way, that set me off on a path that I'm still on today. Because in both those traditions, there's an image of a perfected being. The occult, mystical traditions all have an image of a new form of being, a perfected being. And of course, this was throughout. All those traditions, from alchemy, whatever, into the New Age traditions, the Freemasons, this, that, the other thing, all had an idea of human perfection. And I'll get into that more, obviously, many other times. Now, Marxism also had an idea of human perfection, of an elevated form of human being. And we see it in the Communist Manifesto. Now, Marx didn't often specifically talk about this, but it's there in all his writings. That's, when you get to this advanced future form of society, it's a new form of person, a new form of society. So I started thinking, well, are there two different perfected beings, like one for the occult and one for Marxism? Or is it really the same perfected being, but just two different ways of understanding it and of looking at it? And what I found repeatedly, of course, is that these two worlds were very separate and never talked to each other and still don't talk to each other. And maybe I'm the one of very few who's trying to translate back and forth from the two worlds and also figure out why there are two different worlds. And as an example, the whole New Age movement, all about higher forms of consciousness, higher forms of being, kind of adopting from the Buddhist traditions, Jungian psychology, the Hindu traditions especially, and then the Mayan. There was that whole thing about the year 212 when the Mayan calendar says our whole civilization is going to crash. We're going to get a new civilization, a new person, a new society. And I read some of what was being written at that time. And it was all really good. We're going to have a new form of personhood, a new form of society, everything great. But how's it all going to happen? Well, we'll wake up one day in the age of Aquarius, or the age of 212, and I guess there it'll be. Slightly naive. On the other hand, the Marxists had the opposite problem. They might be talking about revolution, they might be talking about Lenin and Stalin and this one, that one, but you never heard about, okay, where are we headed? What's the new form of society really? And what's the new form of personhood? They never even talked about that. They're just focusing on economic issues. Okay, we're going to have a society, where everybody has enough to eat or whatever. But so the two worlds were totally separate. And so one of the things I hope to do in this series is show how they come together. And in my own search for how they come together, where they originated, I found ancient Egypt. Egypt, when I say ancient, I don't mean Cleopatra. I mean, 3,500 BC. And so let me just say a word about that. When you read the spiritual writings or hear about the spiritual writings, and I've just had some familiarity with it, there are certainly authors like Kaba Kamene who have studied this for years and written books about it. There's a book called Spirituality Before Religion. It's very good. And people who've penetrated that whole system of esoteric wisdom that was found, say, in ancient Egypt. Except I have to correct myself. At that time, it wasn't esoteric. It was just there it was. It was out there. That was their spiritual wisdom. There was esoteric, I discovered, started later on when Christianity was born, and it was repressing a certain form of spiritual wisdom because they wanted everything organized into the church. So all these spiritual traditions that came out of Egypt sort of became encapsulated into these sort of hidden mystical schools. So you got the Egyptian mystery schools, you had the Greek mystery schools, you had Hermeticism, which I'll talk about. And so you had, on the one hand, exoteric organized religions, people going to church, so on. And then on the other hand, the esoteric traditions of, this kind of hidden wisdom, or now it's hidden. In Egypt's time, it wasn't hidden. It's just there it is. Okay, so that's one aspect of where I found it all coming together back in ancient Egypt. So another aspect of my journey was trying to trace the Hegelian dialectic. Now, there are many presentations found on YouTube about the dialectic, also known as dialectics. In certain language, like French, there's only one word. In English, you can either have the dialectic or dialectics. So the dialectic is like this thing out there that's happening. Dialectics is more like a way of thinking. Now, you never hear Marx talk about where did it come from. Some people think, well, it came from Socrates, where this person says this, the other person says that, and they come to a resolution. No. Or it just came from Hegel, he made it up one day. No. So a book came out tracing Hegel, his thinking, to what's known as the Hermetic tradition. So the Hermetic tradition is a tradition of mystical thought that began in ancient Greece around a few hundred years AD. There were these texts written. Now, where did the texts come from? Well, the official line was that the Greek god Hermes got together with the Egyptian god Thoth, and together they came up with these teachings, and then the two gods together got to be called Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes, or Hermes really great. And so that was the author of these books of mystical wisdom. Well, okay, as a halfway sane scholar, I didn't accept that as an explanation that, okay, this god got together with that god and they wrote these books. No. So it turns out, but I had to really look for it because it wasn't like generally known, although it's getting more known. What really happened was Greek scholars were hopping on the boat and going over there from Athens to Alexandria, Egypt, and studying with Egyptian masters, priests, teachers, philosophers, and so on, learning all kinds of things. So many Greek philosophers, Pythagoras spent 20 years there. Plato studied there. A bunch of others went and studied in Egypt. And this is another story I'll get into at another time. But so there also, others were going there and learning from the Egyptian priests, learning the traditions of spiritual wisdom handed down from ancient times that were to some extent in writings, but also just it was a tradition of teachers and students. So then the Greeks the Egyptians hadn't put it all into formal texts. It had been found in various texts early on, the Book of the Dead, the pyramid texts, the emerald tablets, some stone. So this here, that was there, but it hadn't been really compiled and put together in a systematic way. So the Greeks did that and called it these Hermetic texts. Now, it also has to be mentioned that the library in Alexandria, which was the single most important repository of anything the Egyptians had ever written, burned down somehow by accident after Alexander the Great conquered Alexandria. I guess he named it after himself. And somehow the library burned down and a lot of stuff was lost. That's another story I'll get into. So meanwhile, all that was left of the Egyptian wisdom was these books of now called Hermetic wisdom. So this book that I read traces it up through European mysticism, through Kabbalism, alchemy, various forms of mysticism that developed especially in Italy around the 1400s, and then in Germany. You had Meister Eckhart, you had Jakob Bohm, and finally it shows up in Hegel. So there's a direct link from Hegel back to these works of Egyptian mysticism, which is particularly ironic because Hegel, of all people, whose system was the most closely related to ancient Egypt, Hegel specifically came out and said there was nothing interesting in ancient Egypt. They were a bunch of barbarians who had nothing to say about anything. Total racism, but typical of his time. But that was when most of his system, it bore the closest resemblance to the Egyptian systems. So, okay, I had to read further. And again, on YouTube, there's many, many presentations. So one thing I learned is that the ancient Egyptians had a belief system. So this is before mysticism. It was before the occult. It was just there it was. This was their system. So they believed in inner knowledge and outer knowledge. And so the world consisted of inner and outer. So when I first heard that, I thought, oh, that means the outer is the world that we see, and the inner is what's inside our heads, kind of psychology. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. They have a sense of psychology. But then in another reading or lecture, I learned that what they meant by inner is the inner of the outer. So in other words, it's the life, the inner logic or the hidden life of the outer meaning the world that we see. So we see a world in front of us, but behind what we see, there's its life, what makes it tick, what makes it alive, and what makes it a unity, what makes it one living unity that's, in their way of looking at it, it's the mind of God. So being the mind of God, it's one thing. So it's one connected thing. So everything is connected to everything else, and everything is alive. So then it hit me, that's what dialectics is about. That is the definition of what we today call, whether it's for Hegel or Marx, that is dialectics. And it was the Egyptians who first raised it to its highest form of development as knowledge. And I'm sure it began much earlier than that, and I have a theory that it actually began when humans began, but that's a story I'll get into another time. But this is the meaning of dialectics, and the Egyptians had formulated it. And according to this one author, Kaba Kamene, their system was what he calls sacred science. So that the sacred is what's hidden, and the scientific is what's manifest. And so the sacred is just the other side of the scientific, and the scientific is the manifest side of the sacred. So it's really just one reality, but two facets of it are looking at it from two different directions. One is from inside our head, and the other is from the mind of God. So then you fast forward to Hegel, and he's saying basically the same thing. So that dialectic, what he calls the dialectics, is the thought form that corresponds to life, to a living process. So a living process has certain characteristics that make it alive. It's self-developing. It doesn't need anything. It just develops on its own inner dynamic. It has its own life. And dialectics is the form of thought that corresponds to a life process. Now, this is something that's just not generally recognized by Marxists today, who treat dialectics as just some form of logic that showed up one day. And even Engels and Lenin, try as they did to elaborate it and elucidate dialectics, they did not get this aspect of it. But Hegel himself, that's what he said. In his book, The Logic, there's a chapter called Life, and he says it right there, that this is what his dialectics is. It's the thought form of life. Now, so that was very interesting, but what blew my mind is how the Egyptians were basically saying the same thing, 3,500 years ago? Or no, 5,000 years ago? I don't know how many years. A long time ago. It was the same thing, that this what they called the inner was the life of the world that we see. So where does that leave me? That changed my whole view of everything. The fact that we could go back to Egypt and find sort of what Marxists called materialist dialectics, or at least an effort at it. Now, I think ultimately the Egyptians were not successful in elaborating what we would call a materialist dialectics. And this will take a whole other many discussions. But the fact that they had a vision of it, and that's sort of what they were trying to do, and they must have done something, because I don't know how they built the pyramids and had the cosmology and astronomy and mathematics that they had. So they were onto something, and it's still a mystery how they did all that. So seeing that the ancient Egyptians had that, but then it seems like from there until Hegel, or until now, there's some kind of wasteland of forms of thought and of knowledge, because it's like the Egyptian system kind of went downhill. And this is a mystery to me and to everybody. You know, the Egyptians reached a sort of pinnacle of wisdom, spiritual wisdom, scientific wisdom, around when they started out. And then it seems like it was all downhill from there. So if you go, say, 1,000 years, 2,000 years into further development of Egyptian civilization, you don't see how things got better, everybody got smarter. I don't know, I haven't really studied it, but it doesn't look like that's what happened. It looks like things kind of went downhill, and sort of as the surface of society develops more, the more inner aspect of it, the values, the spiritual wisdom, declines. And it seems like that's what happened in Egypt. Then the transition from Egypt to Greece, I think, is a story I'm going to tackle another time. But it seems like if we look at the whole development of thought from ancient Egypt through the rest of Egypt, through Greece, so-called Western philosophy, and so on, it really isn't until Marxism that this idea came about. It sort of recycled, came about again, about materialist dialectics. It's the inner and the outer, what we see and the life of what we see that's hidden until we figure it out. So, okay, I think that's enough for today. I'm going to leave it at that.